The Texas sun still hung high in the autumn of 1944 when the first groups of German prisoners were marched into Camp Hearn. Dust clung to their boots, sweat ran down their collars, and yet the guards pressed bundles of American Army jackets into their arms. The POWs unfolded them and burst into laughter. Compared to the thick wool of Wehrmacht winter coats, these jackets felt like autumn wear for children. Captain Ernst Weber, once stationed on the Eastern Front, turned one over with disdain. A gust of East Prussian wind would tear this apart. He scoffed, his words echoing among the barracks. The other men chuckled, emboldened by his contempt. They pulled the jackets across their shoulders as though mocking, striking poses as if modeling carnival costumes. The scene became one of ridiculed Germans, defeated but still proud, treating American uniforms as a joke in their minds. Memories of German winter campaigns remained vivid. They recalled the heavy Feldgrau coats, thickly layered with wool and lined with felt. Each garment weighed several kilograms. A burden in battle, but a fortress against snow and frost. In comparison, the American jacket, light as air, seemed a flimsy attempt at protection for men who had survived Russian winters. It was inconceivable that such fabric could guard against anything more than a mild breeze. Behind their laughter lay wounded pride. To accept these jackets was to admit dependence on the enemy. To wear them was to confess that the Reich could not even clothe its own men once captured. Weber's sneer masked humiliation. His words, "These are rags, not coats," carried a bitterness deeper than amusement. But their scorn was shared aloud in the barracks that night. Some POWs joked about smuggling them home as souvenirs, while others insisted they would never wear them once true winter arrived. The air was filled with arrogance, the kind that only arises when men cling to old certainties. And yet, beyond the fences, winds from the north were already gathering. That evening, as the floodlights flickered on and the sound of an American train horn drifted across the plains, one younger prisoner named Carl whispered to his bunkmate, "If these jackets fail, we'll freeze before Christmas." His remark was drowned in laughter, but his unease hung in the air, a single thread of doubt amid the chorus of mockery. The POWs did not yet know that American factories in 1943 had produced more than 12 million jackets of this very design, engineered with layers of new synthetic fibers. They did not know that while Germany relied on dwindling sheep and rationed wool, U.S. mills in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania worked around the clock, experimenting with blends of cotton sateen and recycled fibers. What seemed fragile in their hands was, in truth, a weapon of industry light, durable, and wind-resistant. The laughter of that first day would soon be tested. Winter was coming, and with it, the silence of men who realized mockery could not hold back the cold. The barracks quieted after the initial outburst of laughter, but for many of the German officers, the thought of American jackets stirred memories of home and of pride. In their minds, nothing compared to the wool and felt uniforms of the Wehrmacht for decades. Germany had built its reputation on craftsmanship, precision, and tradition. Even a coat was a statement of the Reich's power. Major Hans Richter, a career officer from Hamburg, once described in his diary how a soldier's coat was an extension of the empire itself. His own winter uniform had weighed nearly 6 kilograms, layered with thick Feldgrau wool, its brass buttons polished until they glowed in the dim light of the Eastern Front. He recalled marching through blizzards outside Smolensk in 1941, snow climbing over their boots, ice gathering on their mustaches. And yet the coats had endured. They were not just clothing, but symbols of German endurance in the harshest European winters. By contrast, the American jacket seemed unimpressive, too light, too short, without the grand drape of wool. In whispers across the camp, prisoners comforted themselves with the notion that these garments were proof of American ignorance. "They have never known a true winter," muttered Lieutenant Otto Kruger to a circle of men by the fence. "They think of frost as a nuisance, not a killer." There was pride in these conversations, a stubborn belief that only Germans, inheritors of Prussian discipline and Bavarian resilience, understood the wrath of snow and ice. They imagined American boys from Texas or Alabama trembling if sent to the Eastern Front. This sense of superiority clung to them, even as prisoners. But pride was more than vanity. It was survival, stripped of weapons, of freedom. even of dignity. POWs found solace in small reminders of the Reich's glory. A heavy coat, in memory, became a fortress of identity, and so they exalted their wool and dismissed the American cloth as hollow, a shell without soul. Meanwhile, unseen by the prisoners, the scale of American industry was already shifting the balance. In 1942 alone, the U.S. had produced nearly 35 million yards of wool cloth for uniforms, but shortages forced experimentation. Chemists developed blends of cotton sateen, windproof treatments, and synthetic linings that required fewer raw sheep but yielded jackets that were lighter, faster to sew, and easier to ship. In Springfield, Massachusetts, one factory alone turned out 2,000 jackets per day, its floors echoing with the clatter of sewing machines run by women who had taken the jobs of absent husbands. This was the true difference. German coats were heavy with tradition, made slowly, designed for a soldier's pride. American jackets were born of industry standardized, pragmatic, mass-produced, where one Reich factory might produce thousands. The United States delivered millions. In Camp Hearn, the prisoners could not see the glowing windows of New England textile mills or the rivers stained with dye from Pennsylvania factories. They only had their memories. And those memories told them that winter would expose America's weakness. Yet even memory can betray. Pride in wool and felt would soon be humbled by winds that cared nothing for tradition. By late November, the first signs of an American winter crept into the prison camps scattered across Iowa and Wisconsin. The air grew sharper, carrying with it the scent of pine and smoke from distant farmhouses. Each morning, frost laced the barbed wire, glittering under the searchlights. For the German prisoners, the change felt sudden, almost cruel. What had once been dry heat and laughter now gave way to a silence broken only by the crunch of boots on frozen ground. Inside Camp Algona in Iowa, men huddled together in drafty wooden barracks. The stoves roared with coal, yet the wind seemed determined to push through every crack in the walls. Prisoners who had mocked the American jackets weeks earlier now eyed them suspiciously, pulling them a little tighter around their shoulders when guards passed by. Their arrogance was being tested. One morning, as snow fell heavy for the first time, Sergeant Wilhelm Bauer wrote in his confiscated notebook, "The cold is alive here. It slashes across the yard as though it has knives. Even the guards walk faster, their faces red as the wind bites them." He did not mention it aloud to his comrades, but he noticed something strange. The thin American jacket he wore felt warmer than he expected, not like wool, but steady, like a shield against the constant gusts. The barracks became a stage for small arguments. Some prisoners insisted the cold would eventually break through, that the Americans had given them false comfort. Others, whispering in their bunks, admitted privately that the jacket had saved them from shivering. The pride of German wool clashed with the reality of American cloth. Beyond the fences, the winter was unforgiving. That year, the Midwest recorded some of its heaviest snowfalls since the early 1930s. In Wisconsin, temperatures dropped to 20 degrees Celsius in December 1944, the same month the Battle of the Bulge raged in Europe. While American soldiers froze in the Ardennes, their prisoners, half a world away, endured their own battle with the elements. Guards noticed the shift. Captain Robert Hayes, an American officer stationed at Algona, later recalled, "At first, the Germans laughed at everything we gave them, but once the winds came, I saw them clutch those jackets like lifelines. Pride turns quiet when frost sets in." The silence of the prisoners grew heavier as the snow deepened. Where once they had mocked and boasted of German coats, now they pulled their American-issued jackets close, layering them with whatever blankets they could scavenge. Their voices, once filled with ridicule, now cracked with coughs. The storm had stripped away their bravado. Still, the men waited for the cold to claim its first victims, certain that the flimsy jackets could not endure much longer. Their arrogance was bruised, but their doubts lingered. Winter, after all, was merciless. It was only a matter of time or so, they believed, before the cloth betrayed them. But as December passed and the winds howled louder, the betrayal never came. By January 1945, the snowdrifts outside the camps rose shoulder high, and the winds cut like blades across the open plains. German prisoners, once scornful, now examined their American jackets with a mix of disbelief and grudging respect. The cloth that had seemed laughably thin proved stubborn, shielding them against winds that rattled doors and turned bare trees into frozen sculptures. Private Heinrich Schultz, a young infantryman from Saxony, was the first to admit the change aloud, sitting on his bunk. He ran his fingers over the tightly woven sateen shell and whispered to his bunkmate, "It is strange. It looks like nothing, yet the wind does not pass through." His words hung in the dim barracks, half confession, half marvel. The secret lay in the fabric. The U.S. Army's M1943 field jacket, distributed widely by 1944, was designed not for elegance but for practicality. Its tightly woven cotton sateen, treated with a water-repellent finish, blocked wind in ways wool could not. Inside, a detachable liner made from synthetic fibers added warmth without the weight. Factories in Pennsylvania and New Jersey had churned out hundreds of thousands of these liners, using fibers that German science had once pioneered but could no longer afford to mass produce. For the prisoners, the discovery was unsettling. Their pride in German engineering faltered as they realized that the Americans had mastered something subtler: efficiency. Where the Wehrmacht relied on tradition, the U.S. relied on innovation and scale. Even the seams and buttons were standardized, designed for quick replacement, something the Germans recognized with reluctant admiration. Anecdotes circulated in whispers. One prisoner told of a guard demonstrating how rain rolled off the fabric like drops on glass. Another recalled overhearing a factory worker's gossip, relayed by an American officer. They test these jackets by hanging them in wind tunnels for hours. Such images clashed with the POW's memory of German tailors stitching wool in small batches. Careful, but slow. Letters confiscated from prisoners in Camp McCoy revealed moments of quiet astonishment. One sergeant wrote, "They give us these coats as if they were nothing, as if one could hand out warmth like bread." I laughed once, but now I am silent. Their cloth has beaten our pride. The silence was, in itself, a transformation. Where mockery had once filled the barracks, now there was a kind of uneasy respect. The prisoners did not speak of it openly, but in the long nights when snow hissed against the barrack walls, they clutched the jackets tightly, afraid to imagine what survival would mean without them. The guards noticed too. Some saw the Germans inspecting the seams, fingering the buttons, even sniffing the fabric as if trying to uncover its secret. They no longer joked, they no longer scoffed. The jackets had turned ridicule into quiet dependence, and with every gust of icy wind, the truth sank deeper. What they had once dismissed as fragile rags had become the difference between dignity and despair. The real test came in February 1945 when the blizzards rolled across the Midwest with unrelenting force. In Wisconsin, temperatures plunged to 25 degrees, and snow piled so high that trucks delivering coal to the camps were delayed for days. The barracks groaned under the weight of ice on their roofs, and inside, prisoners clung to their American jackets with an intensity that none of them would have admitted just months earlier. In Camp Algona, the wind rattled the windows so violently that men awoke in the night convinced the barracks would splinter apart. Yet, wrapped in their olive-drab coats, they survived the long hours until dawn. Private Schultz, who once sneered that a real coat must smell of wool, now pressed his face into the synthetic liner, grateful for its warmth. The jacket had become more than clothing. It was a shield, a lifeline. Statistics revealed the scale of what surrounded them. By 1945, over 8 million American field jackets had been produced, enough to clothe not only every U.S. soldier, but thousands of German POWs across more than 500 camps in the United States. No German factory could match such numbers, at best. The Reich could produce a few 100,000 winter coats a year, while its soldiers froze in the Ardennes for the men behind barbed wire. The realization was bitter. They were surviving because their enemy could afford to clothe even its captives. Some prisoners broke the silence with reluctant gratitude. In the barracks, one officer muttered, "We thought we would die here, frozen as punishment, yet we live because of their industry." Others, still proud, refused to voice what they felt, but their actions betrayed them. They layered the jackets beneath blankets, pressed them against their chests at night, and rolled them carefully in the mornings so they would not tear. The transformation from mockery to dependence was not lost on the guards. Captain Hayes wrote in his notes, "The Germans hold on to those jackets as though they were treasures. They laughed at them once. Now I see fear in their eyes when they think of losing them." And then came the snowstorms that sealed the lesson. Days of endless white blanketed the camps, and men trudged in silence to roll calls, their breath fogging the air. They no longer jeered, no longer boasted of German wool. Instead, the sight of hundreds of prisoners lined up in American coats carried its own irony. Men who once swore to fight the United States now owed their survival to its factories. Have you ever underestimated something simple, only to realize too late that it carried more strength than pride allowed you to admit that question? Unspoken among the prisoners, lingers for us as well. The weeks dragged on, and with them came a subtle transformation inside the wire. The jackets had shifted from symbols of ridicule to objects of dependence. But something deeper began to unfold, recognition of the human struggle behind the cloth. Around campfires and coal stoves, American guards occasionally shared stories of their own winters at war. One corporal spoke of shivering in the Ardennes, where snow buried foxholes and frostbite claimed toes and fingers. Another told of mothers back home knitting scarves and sending family blankets to the front, hoping they might reach their sons before the cold did. To the German prisoners, these tales sounded eerily familiar. For the first time, they realized the Americans too had feared the winter, had fought against hunger, frost, and exhaustion. A remarkable scene unfolded one evening at Camp McCoy. Sergeant Bauer overheard two guards arguing quietly about the scarcity of coal rations for their own families. "Even my kids wear secondhand coats this year," one said. Stamping his boots, Bauer wrote in his diary later, "The jacket I wear may be better than what his own children have. What kind of victory is this?" The words reveal a fracture in pride, a recognition that the enemy's humanity could no longer be ignored. It was not just warmth that the jackets represented, but a strange, reluctant bond. A few POWs began to treat them almost reverently, folding them at night with care, as though acknowledging the hands of unseen workers who had sewn the seams. There was gossip, too, whispers that in the factories of Massachusetts, immigrant women from Poland and Italy worked 12-hour shifts, stitching the very coats now wrapped around German shoulders. The irony was sharp jackets made by Europeans in America, protecting Germans from a winter that could have been their end. By March, the prisoners had stopped mocking altogether. They spoke instead in low voices of the vast American machine that could clothe both armies and captives. "It is not just the jacket," Lieutenant Kruger muttered one night. "It is what it proves that they can produce for all, while we cannot even supply our own." His words carried the bitterness of a man forced to acknowledge defeat through the fabric on his back. The humiliation was profound, but so was the quiet gratitude. A duality lingered in the barracks' resentment that survival came from the enemy, and relief that the enemy had allowed survival at all. And now, let me turn to you, the audience. If you had stood among them, would pride have allowed you to admit gratitude, or would you have wrapped yourself silently in that coat, pretending it was still a symbol of mockery? By April 1945, the snow melted into mud, and rumors of Germany's collapse trickled through the camps. The prisoners walked the yards under warmer skies, yet many still clutched their jackets, reluctant to let them go. What had once been a symbol of ridicule had transformed into an emblem of survival, woven into the very memory of their captivity. When repatriation began months later, trunks and suitcases were hastily packed. Amid the few allowed belongings, letters, hand-carved trinkets, sketches of camp life, the jackets often appeared. Folded with care, some POWs risked disciplinary punishment just to carry them home, to their families. These coats were strange trophies, alien in color and cut, but to the men who had worn them through the storms of 1944 to 45, they represented nights endured, lungs spared from the frost, and pride reshaped by necessity. In post-war Germany, many veterans rarely spoke of battles, but they remembered the winters. Old men, decades later, told grandchildren not of victories, but of survival in enemy camps. One former officer confessed to his grandson in a quiet living room in Bremen, "I once laughed at these coats, said they were rags. Then I held mine all night, every night, to keep death from my bones." His words carried both shame and wonder. A lesson passed like a storybook warning. The jacket had become more than cloth. It was proof of American industrial might, capable of producing millions of garments while the Reich starved for resources. It was a reminder of unexpected mercy that even captives were given the means to survive. And it was a mirror of human contradiction laughter turned to silence. Arrogance to dependence. Symbolism clung to them long after the war. In memory, The jacket was not olive drab, but a shifting shade, at first a green rag flapping in ridicule, then a muted shield against the cold, and finally a relic that whispered of both humiliation and life, in one remembered image, drawn from countless diaries. A German POW stands on a frozen morning in Wisconsin, snow sparkling around him. The jacket he once mocked flaps in the wind as the rising sun glints across its fabric. For a moment, it looks less like a garment and more like a flag not of conquest, but of survival. And so the story closes, with fabric that defied arrogance, with stitches that bound men to life rather than death. The jacket remained in memory, an unwanted gift that proved unforgettable. History often remembers wars in numbers, divisions destroyed, tanks produced, lives lost. Yet, when the shouting of battles fades, it is the smaller, quieter details that remain etched deepest in memory. For many German prisoners of war, their most enduring recollection of captivity in America was not the barbed wire or the roll calls, but the jacket they once ridiculed and later clung to as if it were a second skin. The irony was sharp. These men, who had marched proudly in uniforms heavy with tradition, survived the cold not through the wool of their homeland, but through the light, industrial fabric of their enemy. The laughter that once echoed in the barracks gave way to silence, then to reluctant gratitude. What began as an object of scorn became a lifeline. That shift from arrogance to humility, from contempt to dependence, captures something essential about the fragility of human pride. Decades later, old men sat in warm homes in Bremen, Hamburg, or Munich, telling grandchildren not of victories at the front, but of the nights when they feared the wind more than the guns. They spoke of how American jackets, stitched by hands they never saw, saved them in winters far harsher than they expected. And in those stories, a truth lingered sometimes. Survival is not about power, but about the ordinary, the practical, the human. Perhaps that is why memory holds on to the jacket so fiercely. It was more than fabric. It was a symbol of America's vast capacity to turn industry into survival, and of the unexpected mercy of giving warmth to the defeated. It carried with it the unspoken lesson that even in the aftermath of cruelty, humanity can thread itself quietly through seams and stitches. A jacket in the snowplain, unremarkable, yet unforgettable. That is how history speaks, not only in grand battles, but in the fabric that touched the skin of men who once laughed and then learned.